All right, folks. Well, thank you for being at one of our March Mindfulness sessions. I'm Dennis Williams. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and Innovation at Southern Nazarene University, and I am also a historian. And I believe that's one of the reasons that Dr. Crusoe invited me to give a talk on basically the way she framed it up for me was she said, I would like for you to give a talk on trigger warnings. And I was like, what? What do you mean I'm supposed to give a talk on trigger warnings? That's way outside of anything that I was comfortable talking about, because I really believe that's a very technical kind of issue. But then as she unpacked it for me a little bit, she said that she had been in touch with a few students who had remarked on some conversations that we'd had in my world history class that had been uncomfortable, but that had been sort of open-minded about how to deal with issues that were in that particular case about slavery, and therefore very uncomfortable to talk about in a group of folks who had various identities. And so I thought, well, I can't refuse that. So I said yes. And so I thought that to deal with the issue properly, I probably ought to understand this whole trigger warning thing just a little bit. And so the very first part of my presentation today will be a conversation around the concept of trigger warnings, but then it's going to move into a very practical kind of understanding about how historians deal with what is truly a very uncomfortable set of narratives that we are, in my view, kind of required to tell if we're going to tell true stories about the past. So we're going to do two things here, right? Thing one is we're going to talk a little bit about this concept called trigger warnings, but then we're going to move into how do you deal with uncomfortable conversations in the classroom. So without further ado, we'll move in that direction, and I'll see if I can get my screen to advance. All right. So trigger warnings in higher education came to sort of national prominence in 2013 when Oberlin College developed a policy in which it suggested, I guess that's not really the right thing, it required faculty members to understand, avoid, and warn about potentially triggering course content. And that was, oops, sorry. Bump back there. And that was constructed in the context of basically a revision of the Title IX legislation and the regulations associated with that. And in the context of an increased awareness that there was a lot of sexual violence that was occurring on college campuses, way more than one would expect. And so as Title IX grew to encompass that, then one of the issues that began to emerge is that there are a lot of people that have been traumatized that you wouldn't even know that they're traumatized by looking at them. And so it's difficult to deal with what really fell in the disability class of accommodations when it was difficult to understand who might be in the classroom with a particular kind of issue that engaging in particular kinds of content without being thoughtful about it would trigger their prior trauma and cause them not to be able to participate well in the learning experience. And so the Oberlin policy, though, went in a direction that really caught fire in the national press, and it included, for instance, saying that potentially triggering content included issues of racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, cissexism, ableism, and other issues of privilege and oppression. And so if you go back up and you see that, faculty were supposed to understand and avoid and warn about potentially triggering course content, and all of those things on the list were potentially triggering course content, then you can imagine there were quite a few faculty members who would say, wait a minute, you're saying I should avoid teaching about racism, or I should avoid teaching about sexism or classism or colonialism or whatever. And so you might imagine this became kind of an issue about really about, is what role does the administration have to play in telling faculty what they can or they cannot teach in the context of attempting to protect students from, being re-traumatized. So that led to then a AAUP study, the American Association of University Professors. I don't know why that blew up so big, but it led them to do a white paper, particularly their Committee on Academic Freedom. And the AAUP white paper essentially said that administrative regulation that requires faculty members to create trigger warnings for assignments, or that requires a faculty member to create a trigger warning in their syllabus because the course is going to deal with difficult and potentially triggering content, was an overstep on the part of the administration. That an individual faculty member could judge that that would be appropriate and it would be okay for that person to do that, but all faculty could not be required to do that in the AAUP's estimation. The AAUP's white paper went on a little further and said, but recognize that even the voluntary use of trigger warnings in syllabi could be counterproductive because it conflated when people are talking about PTSD, about a person who they themselves have had an experience of trauma. They haven't gotten through that trauma yet, that they experience something else that then triggers their response to that trauma, and then they aren't able to participate in the way that they might want to participate. The idea that the folks at Oberlin were dealing with was this idea that any individual, whether they themselves had been traumatized or not, should be warned that the material is going to be potentially triggering. And of course, from the very technical aspect of, post-traumatic stress disorder, the idea was, but wait a minute, probably most of the students sitting in that classroom did not experience a trauma. So PTSD doesn't really apply in their case. Instead, a person with PTSD who has experienced a trauma needs to go to disability services, get that worked out, and then get the appropriate documentation and whatever to the faculty member. But we shouldn't just apply the notion of PTSD onto the entire student body. The next thing that the AAUP white paper suggested is that creating trigger warnings for particular kinds of content might actually signal what the expected response to the content would be. So what does that look like? Well, if the faculty member puts a trigger warning in and says, you might be, offended by this particular content, then the students in that sort of lower power position might understand that their job is to respond with, yes, isn't that horrible? We're really offended by this material because the prof said I was likely to be offended by this material, instead of engaging with it themselves and coming up with their own understanding of what they're engaging with and being able to contribute with, their own surprised golden nugget out of the material or not. So the AAUP essentially is saying, administration, you can't make a big blanket statement. Faculty members, you can, but it's probably not even wise for you to assign this concept of triggering PTSD to all your students. We might want to back away from that in that higher ed context. They went on to say that doing this was really raising a fundamental question about what the classroom experience was supposed to be about. They suggested that this overarching notion of trigger warnings promoted or reinforced ideas that classrooms should offer protection and comfort rather than an intellectually challenging education. That classrooms should, treat students as if they were vulnerable victims rather than full participants in the intellectual process of education, and that teachers and students alike in a environment which was very concerned that no one be offended or made uncomfortable in the classroom would not raise difficult questions because of the fear of making someone uncomfortable and then running afoul of some kind of administrative edict, which essentially said in some term or another, it's important not to make anyone uncomfortable in the classroom. And so the question became, what's the purpose of the college classroom? What's supposed to be happening there? And so the AAUP went on to say, and I actually, this resonates with me pretty well, as we'll see as we go on in the presentation, that some discomfort is inevitable in classrooms if the goal is to expose students to new ideas that they've never encountered before. If the goal is to have them question beliefs that they've always taken for granted, that's a form of critical thinking, right? If that's the purpose of what's supposed to happen in a college classroom, to grapple with a priori beliefs and to grapple with ethical problems that they've never considered, or even just to expand their horizons and become more informed and responsible citizens, people are going to get uncomfortable as they move outside of what had been their prior normative understanding about the way the world worked. And that, in fact, the college classroom is supposed to make people uncomfortable in these ways, because the college classroom is designed to help people grow beyond their current state of being. And so if that's the case, then the question became, should the college classroom be a safe space or a brave space? And so this again comes out of some of the cultural dynamics around people who understand themselves as being oppressed because of their identity. And there was this notion, still is this notion out in the world, that people who find themselves to be harassed, oppressed, subjugated, etc., may need a safe place, a place where they can go talk with people who share their common sense of discrimination, criticism, harassment, and other kinds of harm, a place where that's not going to be put on them, where they can share their experiences and find some kind of respite away from a world that they find to be damaging, stressful, and oppressive. What the AAUP and others were suggesting, though, and a number of people out in the university's sort of thought world, is that that's probably not the college classroom, that there should be spaces like that. There should be places where people find safety to be able to sit and unpack what's going on in their life. But probably the college classroom is not that place, but instead the college classroom should be something that's called a brave space. A brave space being a place where there can be controversy, but there must be civility, where there can be this sense of, I can experiment, I can put out some ideas, I can own that. My intentions are to explore and to, discover the limits of the ideas that I'm trying to express, maybe changing my mind because I get some new information or a new experience, and I can be challenged and people can push back on some of my ideas. But at the same time, I'm not going to be attacked, and I'm going to be respected, and I'm going to respect other people, and I'm not going to attack them either. But we're going to be sort of grappling with some tough issues bravely together. And it's a space where we're containing that. We're not going to go out of there with this, agenda to destroy the people who disagreed with us in the classroom, because the classroom is a space where we can grapple with issues, tough issues together, and kind of leave it there as we continue to grow and develop as persons with a set of intellectual skills that is expected in college. Which reminded me, of course, as I was looking at that brave space concept, reminded me of that C.S. Lewis's line, which in the wardrobe framing, which, the little girl, you can tell I didn't read these books deeply. The little girl's like, well, Aslan is a lion, I thought, and yeah, he's a lion, he's the greatest of the lions. Well, is he safe? Oh no, Aslan's not safe. Aslan's not safe, he's a lion. And so to me, that's symbolic then in some ways of the college classroom. the college classroom isn't safe. It's a challenging space. It's the space we go to grow in these years of education, or these times of education. So as we think about that, the question becomes, what does this have to do with studying history? Okay, how is history, what does history have to do with, a brave space? Well, here's where I go with this. First of all, I always start my classes with the idea that humans are relatively, as far as we can tell, unique among all the species of the world, because we have really relatively large brains that allow us to imagine realities that don't exist in the present moment, and we can communicate those imaginings through stories. And so we're a storytelling species, and we do that for lots of reasons. Some of the stories we tell one another are ways to transfer knowledge. Okay, I did this thing, you weren't there, and now I'm going to tell you the story about how I did this thing, and then you're going to have the knowledge of how you might could do that thing. And so we tell these stories to one another to transfer knowledge. We also tell stories to one another to share or to disseminate our values. Okay, so there's this really classic, late 19th century reader that children in primary school in the United States read as part of their education, and that reader was called the McGuffey Reader. And the McGuffey Reader had all these quaint little romantic stories, and one of them included the story of George Washington, the president of the United States, the United States' first president, a general during the Revolutionary War, great hero, in American culture in the 19th century. And it was a story about George Washington, the little boy who went, out into his father's orchard with a brand new little axe and chopped down a cherry tree. And his father saw that the cherry tree was chopped down and said, "What in the world happened to this cherry tree?" And young George Washington said, "Dad, I can't tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." Well, what's the purpose of that story? Well, number one, that didn't happen, right? There's no evidence that George Washington ever chopped down a cherry tree and told his father this. Instead, it's this story that's sort of invented and put into the reader to try to disseminate this value that honesty and integrity are really high virtues. And that this heroic character, this George Washington character, had this virtue of, honesty and integrity, and you should too. And we tell all kinds of stories like that, even if they're not, even much more complex stories that try to communicate these values that we have. And in fact, these ILO sessions that this was a part of, these March Mindfulness sessions, are also sessions that are attempting to disseminate some values, right? So this is why we're doing these things, to try to communicate these values of intercultural learning, etc. We tell stories to one another in order to inspire ourselves and others to action, right? So you can imagine that, that famous picture, which maybe I should have used instead of this one, of Martin Luther King Jr. Standing in front of the Washington Monument, speaking to 1 million people, essentially saying, "I have a dream of integration, right? Of culture, social, cultural, economic integration in the United States. So let's all get together and do our part in bringing about this dream into reality. And so let's inspire some action here." And we also tell stories in order to suffuse meaning. What does that mean? Well, that means that we tell stories trying to figure out what life means. Like, what's the point of it all? And so we tell these stories about meaningful life, about why I do what I do, and how much it creates meaning for me or doesn't, in a way to communicate the connections that we're getting with the sort of transcendent purpose of life and living and what it all means. Now, we tell those stories in a variety of ways. Sometimes we tell those stories just like, me talking to you, sitting around the lunch table or something like that. Sometimes we tell those stories in imaginative, fictional kinds of ways. We develop a wonderful schema for, laying out, what does it mean to be a hero and to be a small person, right? And so you have somebody like J.R.R. Tolkien write the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? Or something like that. Lord of the Rings trilogy, as far as I can tell, never happened, but it happened in Tolkien's mind. He shared it, and then it happened in all of our minds as well as we read those books or watched those movies or, whatever we did. But historians are interested in another type of story, and those are nonfiction stories, right? I put those in air quotes, right? Because those stories that we tell, when historians try to tell them, are based on evidence. They're supposed to have some fact underneath them. When historians try to tell stories about the past, they're trying to make connections between what's going on around the particular events they're highlighting. That's context as well, and they're trying to make connections between what went on before and what happens afterwards. So they're trying to create this sense of cause and effect, which is a goal of the story, right? The things you do today have an impact and cause the things that happen tomorrow. That's the big meta narrative that could be told in a historical story. And historians also like to say, and here's this story that you might feel really comfortable with or not, but there are other ways to tell the story as well from other perspectives, and we probably ought to have some clarity around that. There's more than one way that this story could be told, and we ought to tell a truthful story, a more truthful story, get multiple perspectives on the tale we're telling. And that's why I put the nonfiction into the air quotes, because the narrower the story, the fewer voices that are speaking into the story, sometimes is forced because we just don't have evidence. We don't have all those other perspectives in the historical record to utilize, but also without all those extra voices, we also get a story that is deficient in perspective and therefore not as true as it might have really been at some point in time in the past. So that's just a little lesson on what is history, so that we can talk about this, which is that one of the great lessons that I like to raise with students in class is that humans do terrible things. Okay, like that's one of those things, right? That we know humans do terrible things. And so in the instance where I was working on, the modern world class, we were reading a variety of sources, and it happened to be about the transatlantic slave trade as one of the pieces here. And so I was in this moment in class where students had read, Mahama Gardo Bokaka and his account of being, on the shores in Benin and being, all of a sudden just sort of captured and loaded onto a slave ship and transported to Brazil and then sold into slavery in Brazil, and the horrors of that. And they were reading Alexander Falconridge's account of being a ship's doctor on 4 different voyages of slave ships before he became an abolitionist. And we were exposing them to the work of John Woolman, an American Quaker who was trying to convince his Quaker co-religionists in the South, in particular in places like Maryland, to become abolitionists themselves or to release their slaves. And as we were kind of going through this, the way I've done it before, I had a number of students say, "Wow, this is horrible." And I was like, yeah, this is horrible. And they were like, "No, this is horrible." And then I caught, right, that this was not something that was just like an intellectual ascription of, wow, humans do terrible things, but this was this identification that they were having where this was creating an emotional response in them of horror and terror. Some of them could identify with these people who are being rounded up on the beach in Benin and put on this slave ship. They look like me, and this is terrible. And the people who are loading them up, I mean, do they look like you? I mean, like, what's happening here? And that sort of immediately caused me to sort of like sit up and take notice and not just kind of run through the story anymore. And so we really began to unpack this notion of humans do terrible things. But it changed, see, because there's the story that we tell blithely in most of the ways we deal with the world, whatever it is, whether it's historical stories or just stories about what happened with you and your toaster this morning at breakfast. And that is that we tell it stories, to pull on Martin Buber, right? So I, the observer, are dealing with a world that's filled with objects. And those objects don't have any moral content to them. They're just stuff. They're just things. And so, it's me and my coffee cup, and my coffee cup is an object, and I don't have, I can drop the coffee cup on the ground, and I might feel sad about that, but it didn't do anything to the coffee cup other than break it, and that doesn't matter. And so often in life and in the world, right, our behaviors and the way we even think about things objectify everything around us, including other living beings. And that just is what happens. And we tell stories that way. He, she, there's no relationship there. It's just a kind of objectification. And so when we start thinking about these objects, we can put maps on the screen. We can put a schematic of the way a ship's hold was designed in a slave galley that was being, part of the transatlantic slave, or we can put a pen and ink drawing, of slaves being thrown into the hold of one of these slave ships. And we can imagine that it's just like objects, and they don't have any like pull on our heart until they do. And when they do, they become something that is more in what somebody like Martin Buber would call I-thou relationships. All of a sudden, we've got this connection of humanity to humanity, of soul to soul, that begins to reshape us and pull on not just our objectifying mind, but on our subjectifying heart as well. And so we can then tell some other kinds of stories once we move into this I-thou space. And the I-thou space includes the storyline of, hey, humans do awesome things when they actually work together. Okay, and so you've just got all these images piled on the screen in front of you here, which is the story of, the story of abolition, okay, of, particular voices, including the voice of Muhammad, Bakakwa here, and of Akiano here, and then, here's William Wilberforce here, the great, English House of Lords parliamentarian who, pushed forward the abolition of the slave trade for Great Britain. Here's a Punch cartoon, which is, laying out the you can't read it, but it's really laying out the economic roots of slavery, which, essentially says the reason there is slavery is because there are people who buy sugar. And if we weren't buying sugar, there wouldn't be a market for sugarcane. And if there wasn't a market for sugarcane, there wouldn't be slaves in Brazil. And so those economic underpinnings of slavery is what's being sort of laid out here. And then we have, of course, the Underground Railroad with how do you get people out of, enslaved states in the United States, and, and Garrison and Harriet Tubman and John Brown, the abolitionist who led a raid on Harper's Ferry, which kicked off the American Civil War, and on and on we go, Abraham Lincoln, et cetera. And so all of these become these icons, these bits and pieces of evidence to tell a story about how individuals, most of these individuals, took on what Muhammad Bakakwa advocated in his work. And he said essentially this, I'm going to read to you just briefly. He said, let those humane individuals who are in favor of slavery only allow themselves to take a slave's position in the noisome hold of a slave ship just for one trip from Africa to America, and without going into the horrors of slavery further than this, if they do not come out thorough abolitionists, then I have no more to say in favor of abolition. But I think their views and feelings regarding slavery will be changed to some degree. However, if not, let them continue in the course of slavery, work out their term in a cotton or rice field or other plantation, and then if they do not say hold enough, I think it must be of iron frames possessing neither hearts nor souls. And I imagine there can be but one place more horrible in all creation than the hold of a slave ship, And that place is where slaveholders and their myrmidons are most likely to find themselves someday when, alas, 'twill be too late, too late. What's that really saying? It's saying once you actually connect with the soul of an enslaved person and get to understand their conditions, there's no way you can't feel for that and be inspired to action. And the story that you could see laid out, that one could tell using these particular icons in the story of humans do awesome things together. Hey, look, we, abolished slavery at some point in time, whether it be the slave trade in England or slavery as a legal framework in the United States. Isn't that great? Okay, a story to tell. It transmits values, right? It tells strategy, how people did things. It could be inspirational, etc. It could actually get you to hook in and like have some imagination, historical imagination about what it means to put yourself in the shoes of what would it be like to be someone being transported across the Atlantic as a slave. That would be horrible. So therefore I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And therefore I don't want that to happen to somebody else. And so we began to lay down then a kind of ethical concern that we typically describe as the golden rule, right? Do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And so therefore I wouldn't want that to happen to me, and therefore I wouldn't want it to happen to somebody else. So we did a good thing. We, like our ancestors, right? Not us. We didn't actually do that, but it's the story of them. There are, of course, other enslavement stories that could be told, right? You could tell the enslavement story of Jews in a concentration camp. You can tell the story of indigenous children who were rounded up and sent to places like Carlisle Indian School so that they could have the Indian eradicated from them as they were, beaten to keep them from speaking their language, and they're having their hair cut and being, et cetera, et cetera. We could tell the story of labor and sweatshops, and we could tell the story of the Irish potato famine and how that came about through, the British, both a combination of British behaviors in policy towards Ireland and an environmental disaster. We could tell the story of child soldiers. We could tell the story of Palestinians in Israel. We can tell the story of women who are sex trafficked. We could tell the story of diamond miners who work themselves to death in the bottom of diamond mines in places like Congo. We can tell the stories of people who are enslaved by drugs, and we can tell the story of people who are, incarcerated for way longer. Just because of their particular racial identity. We can tell all of those stories in the same way that we could tell a story like the story of the transatlantic slave trade. And the question becomes, could we tell a story of the abolition of these types of slavery, whether it's the story of, and it happened that way, let's take concentration camps, World War II, or I wonder if it could happen that way, the story of Palestinians in Gaza or people incarcerated or diamond miners in the Congo. How do we use these stories becomes kind of an interesting question. Do we simply tell them as it stories, or do we begin to really dig down, get a grip on the people that were or are involved and let them draw our hearts towards changing our behavior in ways that could have some benefit and make the world a better place? Of course, we can tell other stories as well, right? Humans do good things, bad things, and different things, all kinds of things together. If we were to go back to that slide on abolition, maybe I'll jump back there just for a second. Notice down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you see a statue of William Tecumseh Sherman, who was in the Union Army, one of Lincoln's generals who marched the Union Army south through Georgia into Atlanta, breaking the back of the Confederacy, ending the Civil War, and as a result of that, leading to the total abolition of slavery and Reconstruction in the United States. that's quite heroic. And there's, Lady Liberty going before him, and we can, all sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, perhaps, or something like that in the square in New York where the statue stands. But if we take that very same statue and we put it in a different context, right? Here's William Tecumseh Sherman riding on his charger. And here in 1852 is a gold coin from California, celebrating California statehood, but really celebrating the fact that gold was struck in California in 1849. And we have the beginnings of a gold boom there. And after the Civil War, that interregnum gets over with, you have somebody like William Tecumseh Sherman, whose responsibility as the director of the commanding general of the American Army to figure out how to get across the plains and get through the indigenous peoples who live on the plains and who are trying to preserve their land, people like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and others. And so William Tecumseh Sherman puts into play, the ambitious general George Armstrong Custer and many others to go and subjugate the Indians on the plains. Those former slaves who now, are looking for jobs, right? Trying to figure out how to make a living, join the army, and they become buffalo soldiers on the plains, fighting for the U.S. Army against Sitting Bull and his people, Crazy Horse and his people, in order to subjugate them and move them onto reservations. The buffalo that those plains tribes had lived hunting for thousands and thousands of years were killed off and turned into essentially hides and buffalo tongues. But what they were really killed off for is the starving out the plains tribes. And then those ecological niches that the buffalo had lived on become the niches on which at first longhorn cattle and later blooded Hereford and other cattle were raised on, leading to the development of a cowboy culture and the railroad finally traversing the plains and connecting the East Coast with the West Coast and those California gold fields. There's a story for you, right? That's a story that actually connects. Oh, look, here's the story of us, abolishing slavery. And here's a hero of that story, William Tecumseh Sherman, who becomes the villain of another story, which is the subjugation of the indigenous people on the plains. Those are both really uncomfortable stories. One, the story of slavery and its dissolution with maybe a good story that then flips over into, if you have an identity around being an indigenous person, then that's a tragic story to have your people writ large finally reduced to subjugation and put on reservations and pressed into poverty for several generations and still living with the effects of that. So what do we do then with these uncomfortable stories? We can't take the position that, well, that would be an uncomfortable story, we shouldn't tell it. We also can't, if we're going to tell the story, tell a story of how, colonial powers, the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish and others, went into a new world and spread disease and terror and enslaved people and did all of these sorts of things. And somebody else could raise their hand and say, hey, that makes me uncomfortable because, I didn't do those things. And this is the context in which we're in. So how do historians deal with that? Telling those really uncomfortable, well, at least you hope they're uncomfortable stories about what humans do together. Well, you could tell I-it stories about it. Commonly, that's what we do. You could tell I-thou stories and get a little empathy going. What I like to do, or I encourage myself on my best days to do, is tell I am stories and get students to really embrace this sense of I am. So here we have, the Matthew 27, verse 51 imagery here. At the time of the crucifixion, Jesus dies and the veil of the temple is rent in two, and an earthquake, shakes Jerusalem, and the tombs are broken open. And at the time of the resurrection, not just Jesus, but a whole bunch of wise and good dead people walk around for a while and visit, their ghosts visit along the way. So what are we really, pushing for here? Well, here I'm really saying that this transcendent thing that just happened, which is God and human beings were able to come together, and God could then experience what it was to be a human being in its totality, gives us a sort of an avenue in our own consciousness and our own awareness to say, you know what? To some extent, I am like all of those other human beings that have ever played a role in any past experience that humans have done. I am, in some way or another, human enough to identify with what it might be like to have been rounded up and thrown into a concentration camp. I am also human enough to be able to very easily imagine the set of beliefs, concepts, and ideas that would have persuaded me to be a member of the Nazi Party and perpetrating that on those Jewish people. Why? Because I am a human being, and I do have full access to all of that range of conceptual patterns and emotional content. See, once you get there, that's a really challenging place to be. I can no longer hold off and essentially say, you know what? I'm really good. They're really bad. I have nothing to do with them. They are the other. I can other them, judge them, and be done with them. No, I have to embrace it and say, and that's me too. One of those little phrases like, but for the grace of God, there go I. Well, I encourage myself and I encourage my students to really embrace this idea that all of the roles that are being played by participants in these past stories are roles we could just as easily play in the same context, in the same circumstances. And then I want them to ask a further question. And that is, how are those circumstances and contexts actually manifesting similarly in the world in which we live today? And what role are we playing inside of them as we play our roles? And I get them to start thinking about, and I think with them, because we have an open conversation about this, what do we do when we realize that those diamond rings that we buy one another might be coming out of diamond mines where people are being enslaved to mine diamonds? What do we do about that? That was the Punch cartoon about sugar and slavery. Well, is that the same? What about the shoes that I buy that say made in Vietnam? What do I know about shoemaking in Vietnam? But does buying those shoes really, is that on the up and up, or is that promoting some vicious kind of economic model that actually oppresses people? What do I do about this? Or how about my attitude towards nativism in the United States and the way that's expressing itself in the popular media, and xenophobia? What do I do with that? Because I can see where in the 1930s that went in lots of places around the world. What's my role? How do I play in this space? And so as we began to engage with that conversation about why me and why now, as the Taco Bell package on the screen puts it, the question that I want to encourage my students and myself to engage with is, we now know something that we didn't know before we worked on this together. And now we have an obligation to do something with it. What are we going to do with it? Maybe nothing, But as we begin to align ourselves and understand better what our values are and how we would like to align our behavior with our values, and we begin to set a few small things in motion, just even mentally to do that, we might actually be creating something that has a longer term consequence in terms of the things we engage with, the energy we put into certain aspects of life versus others. And so that becomes what I think is the experience I'm trying to create, dealing with difficult content in the classroom. So I'm not going to avoid talking about things that are disturbing, troubling, because only by talking about those disturbing and troubling things that human beings do with one another do I get any access to making a decision about what I'm going to do with the people around me. Drawing the line sometimes with, wait a minute, that looks like it's getting a little too close to a way of thinking or a type of behavior that I've seen what the consequences of that are. I don't think I want to go there. Or, wow, actually lining up with this and putting some energy onto this could actually change the world. I want to do that. And so it brings me finally to that point of saying, aligning myself with the wisdom of Gandhi and saying, I need to be the change I want to see in the world. So as I begin to imagine what a world is where everybody gets to make their contribution to making the world become a better place, part of my contribution becomes, how do I shape a conversation where people understand what a good looking world is and how people have behaved in the past to get there and how people have behaved in the past to make it a pretty cruddy place for a whole bunch of other people. So what do we do with that? So now I will stop at that point and I will stop sharing my screen and I will open up the room for just conversation. So if you want to share something into the conversation here, if you want to, make some observations or get my screen up here where maybe, I don't know what I just did. Okay, if you want to do that, then just chime in at this point. Meeting is now yours.